So we're down to chapter 7. All right, that's 7, and I think a little bit of 8 today, because 7 is really short. So let me bring it up. So security assessment. You have to test your security systems to see if they work, of course. Pen testing is one common kind. You pay for people to find vulnerabilities and then exploit them and accomplish some sort of theatrical thing to impress upper management. And then, after they get in, they provide a report. And we've been doing this at the pen testing contest, and the report is quite a job. It has to be accessible to non-technical management. You have to explain, here's what we found, here's what we regard as the most serious problems, here's what we recommend to fix them. And then there's an appendix all full of all the technical details for the boss to hand the technical team. But your main value for a pen tester in a company is the intelligence of the pen testers analyzing the network and the business and saying, here's what's actually hurting your business most that you should fix. And these other things you can afford to leave alone for a while. Social engineering is a big part of all pen tests these days. This is probably the major vulnerability everywhere, is tricking the people into doing stupid things. So calling them on the phone, talking them into handing out secrets, finding that they're throwing things in the trash they shouldn't be throwing away, sending them emails and such. All these things have to be tested. And you have to warn your staff, and they have to change policies and procedures and monitoring and such to fix it. So sometimes you provide the pen tester with a lot of information about the network, and sometimes you don't. So there's a lot of tools you use here. They often use vuln scanners and automated attack tools in addition to their own toolkit of things they play with. And there's steps here. First, you plan the pen test, and of course, first you negotiate a contract and get the rules of engagement, which is what exactly do you want us to test, what things do you not want us to mess with, and make sure that's clear. Then you recon the network from the outside to find out what's going on in the company too, by Googling it and examining their web page and such. Then you scan devices to find out what's there, and you enumerate the services offered by the different devices, and then you find the vulnerabilities, exploit them, and then you make a report listing all the things you did. And a good pen tester always has a success rate of 100%. So they always get domain administrator. Mm-hmm. No matter how much you patch it, your network is always vulnerable. There is always a way in. And at first, this really bothers people. They want to imagine that you could have good enough security to stop people, but that is over. People have given up pretending this. There is no preventive measure that will actually keep 100% of the attackers out. Some of them will always get through, just like you always have some employees that are stealing money, some employees that are lying about their sick days, there's always some clown that sets fire to something in the building sooner or later. You can't prevent these things 100%, so you have to have a response team to deal with the ones that get through. All right. So your pen testers, of course, have to sign a non-disclosure agreement, and they have to keep the things they find secret. You will probably find secret company data. You'll find their proprietary PDFs, their customers' social security numbers, and all that jazz somewhere on the network. And even the vulnerabilities you find are also confidential. You don't want anybody telling the world about your vulnerabilities, because even if you are a very good company and you patch them, you won't patch them right away. And so the report is a confidential product. So you can do vulnerability scanning with something like Nessus or OpenVAS or Hailstorm or something. This sends a lot of requests to the server. It often takes like 24 hours and floods the server with a lot of requests, so it's not generally a good thing to do on a live network. And it gives you a report of all the things it finds. These things are fantastically noisy and fantastically inaccurate. It will miss a lot of vulnerabilities, like half the ones it's specifically designed to find, and it will report a lot of false positives claiming things are vulnerable when they are not. So you have to go and manually test what it finds. The only reason you use these things is it will be thorough in a way. It will really click every link, really go to every file, every folder, and really try 10,000 things against each of them, which your manual testers will not. So this is part of a test, but not the whole thing. Sort of like every time you go to the doctor, that you get your blood pressure and stuff, just on general principles. So a security audit is compliance auditing, and I think next semester, or else the semester after, Richard Wu's going to start teaching CISA here, which is a really good thing to get. Security auditing is a very in-demand field because somebody has to, it's not considered terribly exciting work because it's not direct combat with criminals. It's more like being the tax or HR person, but it's steady work and they need a lot of people. It's a business function where someone has to have quite a lot of technical knowledge, and you have to make a business process and a software process and in the company so that you can not only meet one of these standards like PCI DSS or COPPA or HIPAA, but you can then produce audit reports to prove that everything is encrypted, everything is stored correctly, the right people have access, we have monitored who went in and made sure that the wrong people didn't get in. And, you know, just like you have to make tax forms, you have to make compliance reports, proving that you have done all that. And it takes an auditor, and there's a certification, the CISSP, for that auditor to have, meaning they are qualified to set up this system. So security assessment, you check everything. You check, of course, the network security with firewalls and antivirus and all that jazz, and then you check the policies and administration and the change management and many other things to make sure that all the aspects of the company are up to the required standard. And if you have one of the real burdensome standards like ISO 27000, it takes 5 years and several $1 million to reach that, and it's a big deal. There's a blizzard of paper flying around. There's various levels of reporting to other levels to meet that standard. And once you do it, then you can play with the big customers like the DoD and the huge insurance companies and stuff that require you to be up to that level. All right, so you have internal audits, which are just for internal consumption, where you measure within your own company whether you're obeying your own policies and whether your controls are having the desired effect. And then there's external audits, where you pay someone to come in from the outside. If you take credit card numbers and you get more than, it's either 200,000 or 300,000 transactions per year, you are required to pay for a QSA, which is a special auditor specified by the credit card company. There's certain people that come in and do a pen test and do an audit from the outside every year. All right, the log reviews are a big part of it. Every device is logging things. You have to have a process of auditing these logs to see if you detect anything bad. That means you typically want to have centralized logging, so it all goes to one place, and then you can look at it with something like Splunk or the SIEM system. And then you have to retain the logs for some period of time for regulatory compliance. All right, and you have to test your software. So your programmers are, of course, making errors. You can do source code review if you're writing your own stuff, and that helps, but you can't do everything that way. So there's static analysis, where you just look at source code, and then there's dynamic analysis, where you run it and try to see what happens. And there's a lot of semi-automated fuzzing products where you actually alter the code to put in like extra notations and branch points, and then you run the modified code in order to make sure that you have investigated every bit of code. Because what typically happens is your normal business only uses a certain portion of the code, and the rest of it would only happen if something strange happened, like there was a missing item or a zero somewhere. And if your testing doesn't hit that, then this code could be defective and you'd never know it. So that's the game here. Static code is when the code is not running, you use things like lint that just go through the code and look for patterns of source code that have known vulnerabilities like format strings, vulnerabilities and buffer overflows, and then dynamic testing, where you feed in data. If the white box testing, where you have the source code, or the black box where you don't have the source code, and you're just feeding in a lot of inputs, every place input can go in trying to make it crash or to do something unexpected. So you can have a traceability matrix, which compares your software testing plan to the customer requirements, so you make sure to test the particular features that your customer cares about. You simulate business activities to make sure it works for them. And you can have various kinds of testing. Unit testing tests the individual components. Installation tests it as it first is installed, and then integration testing to see how it fits with other things. And then regression testing is what you do after modifying it. This seems to be where Microsoft has fallen down this year. They make patches for Windows and they break everything, and Microsoft does not seem to detect that in time to fix it. And then there's, of course, acceptance testing, which makes sure that it actually meets the customer's requirements. So there is certification, which you might have if you passed the CISSP, and then there is accreditation, which means some customer decides that this is good enough, and those are not exactly the same thing. They might be connected, but your customer might want something more or different than just a standard certification. So I mentioned fuzzing. Fuzzing is where you just send a lot of randomly mutated data to the device. You take whatever normal input comes in and you modify it. Make it long, put in null bytes, flip bits, and There's dumb fuzzing, where you just use standard mutation, and there's smart fuzzing, where you try to understand what kind of packets are going in and exactly how to modify them. But anyway, you just try, it's one form of dynamic testing. And this turned out to be extremely powerful in the last 10 years. Many, many products have fallen this way. There's a group that fuzzed, for example, the Linux kernel and found hundreds of vulnerabilities that had never been found in other ways. And so here's another form of testing where you do combinatorial testing to try to change multiple things at once to see if you hit unexpected conditions. And then there's misuse case, where you try to define what abuses could happen and do them. And this is why Microsoft evolved over this. Microsoft's original philosophy was we don't need to have software that can withstand deliberate abuse. The only thing we need is software that will let honest users get their work done. So we want to be able to work under normal conditions, and we want to be able to tolerate honest mistakes. So a person is trying to do their job. We're not going to worry about a hacker who would actually carefully craft some malicious input, because that's nuts. But now that is the case. We know that's happening, and Microsoft knows it's happening, and everybody else that's up to modern standards knows it's happening, and they do have to plan for it and attempt to catch those vulnerabilities. So like I say, you can test to see how much of your code you have actually tested. You can see how many lines of source code are actually activated by your scanning and testing, and see what parts have been tested. And there are smarter fuzzers that actually modify the code to make sure you exercise it all. All right, so you can do the test results, but if you do the test results and it finds some strange answers, then it's a really big job. This is what I was saying about vulnerability reporting. You tell a company there's a problem, well, it's actually a really big job for them to figure out what does that problem mean and what would we have to do to fix it and what would we break by fixing it. It's expensive and complicated, and they have to be motivated. So it's not easy. Someone tells you, something, your car is making a funny noise. It's a mile from that to figuring out what's really wrong and fixing it. All right, so I got some hoots about that stuff. So which process would ensure HIPAA compliance? Okay, that's an audit, good. All right, which one runs on UDP 514? That's syslog, good. All right. What process happens after you update software? Or at least it should.
It crashes.
Yeah, well, that's right. It's regression testing. And what does Microsoft highlight in their SDL? Threat modeling. They were the ones who pushed that. Very important. All right. So administrative security. I used to have no patience with administrative controls because I think like a lot of technical-oriented people, I trusted things like antiviruses and firewalls, and I thought that administrators are just idiots yelling at people for no reason. But it turns out to be very effective, and I was very impressed by Apple iOS. iOS is secured not because of technical controls, but because of administrative controls. They force you to get every app from the store, and humans prevent you from putting bad things in the store. And that turns out to be very effective. So administrative controls can be very strong. Anyway, here's some common administrative controls. Least privilege. You don't let people have more privileges than they need to do their job. Need to know. You don't let people have information they don't need so they can't leak it. And you have separation of duties. So critical activities have to be approved by two people. And this is the way everything worked when I was in business. You would have people doing work, and you'd have a supervisor check the work to make sure it was right. I was very troubled when I came to teach college, and I'm teaching a class, and there's nobody auditing me to see if I'm doing it right. From the business world, you'd never do that. You don't hand work to people and call it done. You have to review it before it goes to the client, or everyone will hate you. The point of separation of duties is now you'd have to have collusion of two people to commit fraud. And if you are in a more gentle term, you'd also have to have two people make a mistake to commit an error. Where I was working, we never talked about fraud. I don't think anybody was doing that, but people were certainly making mistakes, and that was the point. People make mistakes, and you have someone review it, and that gets rid of the mistakes. And what my boss said is, if you don't get rid of the mistakes, at least you spread the blame around. Now, if something goes wrong, it's not just one person's fault and you're getting fired.
Yeah.
That's why they kept on taking away my backup database administrator at my company until I was working alone. And that's when I said, I think I'll go teach college, because I had also got old enough that I didn't like fight with them and call them idiots. I said, it's not that I want to criticize your wonderful company. I have something else I'd rather do, which is the right thing to do. No point being mean or living on bad terms, but the fact is I was working alone with hundreds of millions of dollars, and I was not willing to accept that risk anymore. And after I left, those cases all did go to hell anyway. I was no longer in charge at that point. So sort of like jumping off of Trump's administration before something horrible happens. I don't think I want to be the captain in charge of this ship when what's coming happens. Then there's job rotation, where you move people from one job to another. And this way, nobody can have a trick, because it's fairly common that people have some kind of complicated scheme to steal money. And they have some way of covering it up so that they make a fake account, and somehow they hide the account so that people checking it don't find it. And when you have someone else take over their job for a while because they're on vacation or something, they will find that out. So when you have an employee that works all this overtime and won't ever take a vacation, that makes you nervous that they might be doing something bad, and rightly so. Right. That's why mandatory leave and forced vacations are good. You must leave, you must let someone else do your job for a while. Also, that prevents another problem, which happened at a lot of the companies I worked at, which is we get the indispensable person. Nothing can happen without that one person. They're the only one that understands the network or something. And you should never let that happen, because all the people might get sick, might quit, might get disgruntled. Nobody should be irreplaceable. You should have somebody, if there's only one person that understands it, you should train somebody else to catch up with them. It's just much better. And non-disclosure agreements we talked about. Everybody at your company has access to stuff they shouldn't just be telling the world about. And background checks are extremely valuable. It turns out, I think I've seen numbers like 80% of all fraud and theft on the job would have been prevented if people actually called the companies in their resume and said, what did this guy do at the last job? He fired him because they stole. And if you would have checked, they just don't check what's in the resume, which would have revealed that. So you have to check what people are doing with their privileges. You have administrators and other people that have the ability to do things like create accounts, reboot machines, back them up and restore them. And you should have some review process of seeing what they did with those privileges to see if they're doing the right thing, or if something bad is happening, because your high privileged people can do a lot of bad things and you would never know. And that's really your only control. And then there's forensics. Once you have some kind of problem, then you have to collect evidence. Now, the original point of this was for police to get evidence to prosecute someone in court, and that is one field of it, but that's really a small part of it. Far more common than that is just corporate environment, where you don't plan on going to court or putting anybody in jail, but you still need to figure out what happened so you can stop it from happening, and you can punish people without going to court by just firing them or something. But you do need to figure out who did what here. So first you have to collect the evidence from the machines and the network and such. And there are things that make this difficult. There's, for example, all these encrypted messaging apps people are talking about. They just blocked one in Russia. People are always mad about this. They're arguing in the government in Washington whether it's okay for politicians to use encrypted apps, because there's not a log being kept of it all. And that's one of the many things. There was a problem with Hillary Clinton using a private email server, and she had been told not to, and she lied and said she had been told it was okay when she was emphatically told it was not okay, because there are a lot of problems with it. And one of the many problems with it is it doesn't keep a record of everything, and it's required by law that you keep a record of all the government communications. So anyway, like we mentioned earlier, the malware is entirely memory resident. Then it gets harder for review processes to catch it, and it doesn't put anything on the disk. So these days, when you do forensic analysis, you have to capture the RAM also. 5 years ago, people didn't worry about that so much. But now, that's where a lot of the evidence is. Yeah.
If you put the computer to sleep, would it save on the hard drive then?
Sleep, I think it depends on how it works. Hibernate, it definitely saves the
hibernate. Yeah.
Sleep.
Oh no, sleep keeps the memory active.
Well, sleep is a kind of weird thing in modern Windows machines, because it goes down to such low power. I think it does put some on the hard drive, but it's actually pretty complicated. It's sort of between what we used to call sleep and what we call hibernate now.
And I was wondering about like VMs, if you take a snapshot, is that going to capture
Yes, it should. In fact, that's a recommended procedure. A snapshot of a VM should capture all the hard drive and all the RAM.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that, by the way, is about the only thing you can do with like a cloud machine.
Yeah.
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 'Cause that's,
What's up?
So how do you go backwards and say, oh, that computer in Russia did this?
That computer what?
That computer in Russia did.
Oh, to find out who did it?
Yeah.
Oh, that's attribution. And attribution is very difficult. I mean, because, of course, even if you were to track the IP address back to a machine in Russia, that doesn't mean that the person in Russia attacked you. It could be somebody else
Right.
that hacked a computer in Russia to hide it from you. So that's why most companies just give up. They say, it doesn't even matter who hacked us. All I care about is, was it one of my employees or someone on the outside?
Well-
If it's someone on the outside, I don't care who it is. I just want to figure out how to put a firewall up or something and stop it. Because hunting them down and prosecuting them, the only people that care about that are the cops.
Well, they're acting so sure, like, I know it came from Russia. I know Putin did this.
Well, that's, a lot of people are very, very skeptical of that. Like the U.S. government, a lot of people argued about who hacked Sony. And the U.S. government finally said it was North Korea. And a lot of people said, wait a minute, I'm not convinced it was North Korea at all. And a lot of people are still not convinced. You can never really be sure.
yeah.
This is what Mandiant does, and Kaspersky are kind of the leaders in this. They really track it down, and what they do is the same thing cops do to prove things. They get a preponderance of evidence. They look at the IP address and the time of day, and they analyze the code to see when it was compiled, and they compare it to other tools that they've also analyzed, and they slowly develop a profile of a criminal gang. And that's why they call them like APT1, APT10, APT15. They slowly build up a profile of what they do, and then they can make a reasonable deduction of who did it. But it's never 100%.
So if some guy says, the FBI says, you know, he did it.
Well,
Or the CIA said,
they do. And see,
That's
this
what I'm saying.
is why,
You're very
for example, the Russians just poisoned 2 people in London with nerve gas. And then they denied it. And then people said, well, you don't really have proof, and they don't really have proof. But you probably never will have proof. So really what they're doing is they're saying, well, who hits these people? They were Russian double agents. So the Russians are the ones that hate them. So that makes them like 90% likely it was the Russians anyway. Then they used the Russian gas. So that makes it pretty likely, but it's not 100%. You know, when the Twin Towers came down, Bin Laden said, hey, you can't prove I did that. And they never really proved that he did that, but he said he was going to do it. It was reasonable to conclude that he did it, but we didn't reach the level of proof like in a murder trial. You never really had a court and evidence and a defense attorney and all this process of proof. And as we now know from DNA evidence, even that whole process is not all that accurate. There's a lot of people on death row that are innocent. I think they found 20% of them. DNA proved they were innocent. So even the most strict, burdensome process we have is not really all that accurate. So you never really know who did the bad thing. But you try to do the best you can to figure it out. Because you'd like to imagine that there's somebody you could fire and that would help lower the amount of crime in the future. And to some extent there is. And to some extent people just blame whoever they're bigoted against and stuff, and on you go. It's a very inefficient, imperfect process. So you identify the evidence, like you might have a virus spreading through your network, so you figure out which machines are infected and you try to backtrack it and see how it came in. Then you acquire the evidence from those machines by making things like copying files from them, maybe even the whole hard drive and memory, although for instant response you try to do more targeted things and get just certain things like the registry keys and a few files, so it's not an overwhelming amount of data. You analyze it and then you produce a report, because of course management always has the same issue. What caused the problem? How much damage did it do? How much will it cost to fix? How do we really make sure it's fixed? And how do we really make sure it won't happen again? And that's what you have to figure out. All right. And if you want a good example, look at Cloudflare. Cloudflare has had 5 or 6 security incidents in the days they've been in business. And the great thing about Cloudflare is they have complete explanations when it's over. Here's what happened, here's how we found it, here's how we fixed it, here's how we put in a new control so it won't happen again. Nobody else ever goes public with that information, and I think it's very clear that a large amount of companies can't really do that. They just sort of put out the fire, send some email to people, reset some passwords, and keep going, and they never really figure out exactly what happened all the way to the root cause. And that is understandable because it's difficult, but it's not the way to have a secure ship. You should really get to the bottom of anything major that went wrong. So live capture is capturing information from a system while it's running. Therefore, it is not a snapshot in time and it changes if files are changing, but you can do it without taking something down. One case where you have to do this is if you're at a corporation and you, for example, think someone is stealing money. You find some funds missing, you find some falsified accounts, and you don't know who did it. Your suspects might be high privileged people in the company, like the head of accounting and the vice president and stuff, and you might want to investigate them without telling them. Because if you tell them you're under investigation, we're suspending you, we're throwing you out of the office for a week, we're going to take apart your computer, they might get very angry and quit. So what you do, and this is what Encase will sell you this software, the enterprise stuff, they will put an agent on your box, and while you're working, it will be quietly imaging your whole box over the networks. You don't even know what's happening. So without telling anybody, we can subtly investigate your machine, get a copy, and then determine something, and you never need to know you're under investigation if we decide you're innocent. We don't have to insult you, and we don't need any legal authority or anything because you're a company. If you're using company equipment at work, the company has the right to investigate all your network transmissions, hard drive, and everything anytime without telling you. It's company property. Anyway, you can make hard binary images of the storage devices, and if you get a binary image of the entire storage device, you can sometimes recover deleted files. Back in the days of magnetic hard drives, this worked very well. In the modern world with SSDs, it's much less effective. You don't get as much of the deleted files because a lot of them are automatically scrubbed in the background by garbage collection. So there's, when you do get hard disk files or the older kind of SSD where there actually is latent data, then there's allocated space is what everything has. That's normal files with file names that are in use. Unallocated space is space that used to have a file, but that file has been deleted, but the remnants of that file are still there. Then there's leftover space at the end of clusters containing fragments of files, and there's bad blocks, which are blocks that had a read error, so they were marked bad and replaced by other blocks by the drive controller, and they will never be erased. And they have fragments of data in there. Usually, the data is pretty much intact. But still, this is the kind of stuff, this is mostly what you want. Allocated space, normal files that are in use. That's the normal files people see when they open my computer. These are all leftover things that might have evidence, and if a criminal tries to delete the stuff to hide it, on a magnetic hard drive, that just makes it much easier to spot. You look at whatever's deleted in the last day, and it's still sitting there, and now it's put a red flag on it. This is the stuff they felt bad about. So there's a lot of tools that will do this kind of forensic image. Norton Ghost can do it in forensic mode. FTK Imager is a free product. FTK is Forensic Toolkit, and it's one of the, FTK and Encase are the big players in this field. Almost everybody uses one or the other. They're both commercial products. They run on Windows. They're expensive. You can get certification from the company, access data for FTK and Encase for the other. Police departments almost all use Encase. The FBI uses FTK. Corporations use either of them. We have a forensics class here, and we just got some money, which I'm hoping we can use to send Alan off to get Encase certification and make that an Encase certification class, because I think that's what it should be. I'm going to teach instant response next semester. I took the old forensics class, and we're splitting it into two classes. One will be Encase certification, which is forensics, and the other will be instant response, which is the new stuff, because they're different, and they deserve two classes. Right now, our forensics class has been sort of general, covering a little bit of these and some open source tools, but I really think we should teach one of these certifications, either Encase or FTK, but I think it'll be Encase. Encase, I think, is the one that is most famous. They call it NCE, is the certification, and that's considered good. It'll get you a job. So it's a good thing we should be teaching up to. So probably in a couple of years, we'll get that working and have Encase certification here. Then there's network forensics. This is where you are not imaging a hard drive or RAM, you're capturing network packets and figuring out what happened over the network. This is what happens at DEF CON, at the Wall of Sheep, and the network capture the packet contest and the network packet detective or something, is the thing I run. I'm part of the team that runs that at DEF CON. It's a lot of fun. So this is closely related to intrusion detection, where you're getting network packets and trying to figure out whether there's a bad thing in there. You're getting all the network stuff, emails, IMs, file transfers, and all that jazz. And use Wireshark as your #1 tool, but there's a lot of other tools you can use also. So once you get a binary file, you've got it from a network or from a hard drive or from RAM, then you got to figure out what it does, and that's malware analysis, which you got a class in here. So you have this file, and you have to figure out if it's a good file or a bad file. So there are a lot of ways to do this. If you can send it to antivirus engines like VirusTotal, you can run it in a virtual machine and measure what it does with monitoring tools, or you can just unpack it with IDA Pro and look at the raw assembly language and read it to figure out what it does, and those are all techniques that you use as appropriate. Then there's embedded device forensics. You have routers and cell phones and firewalls and all these devices with their SSD memory, and they also have data on them that you want. E-discovery is a subset of forensics that is very big. Because you know America is famous for being a litigious country, if you are a large corporation doing business, you will just have a steady chain of lawsuits against your company from people for this and that. And you will just have to have a legal team constantly defending yourself from all these lawsuits. And one thing that happens in almost every lawsuit is you get a discovery order. They say, you must hand over all the information about this accused business practice. So one of the famous cases was Google versus Sun. Sun sued Google because Google made Android, and Android, everything uses Java. And Sun made Java, and it's not free software. It's part of it's free and part of it's proprietary. So Google made Android depend on Java, and Sun sued Google, and then Oracle bought Sun, and Oracle is much harsher and nastier than Sun even. So they vigorously pursued this lawsuit against Google for years and said they wanted billions of dollars of royalties for the Java they put in Android. And at first Google won, and now it seems like Sun won about a month ago. And Google's going to have to pay a huge fine, but that's the kind of thing that happens. So the first thing that happens when you get a lawsuit is even before you go to court and argue about it, they say, we have a discovery order. You must hand over all the emails, design documents, and everything else about how you use Java for the last 7 years. So you have to find all that stuff. And this is why it's really bad if you have somebody like Hillary Clinton that puts some of it at home on some server that you don't have access to. Now you have to turn over all the emails, and you don't even have all the emails on your server. And if you don't hand over all the data, you will get a judgment of contempt by the judge, and they will rule against you summarily for failing to comply with the discovery order. So it is not acceptable if your employees are taking company stuff and putting it somewhere where you can't find it. Anyway, so this thing is called e-discovery. It's a specialty where you learn how to find evidence on networks, and you learn how to deploy indexing software on the network so that it will be easier to find the evidence when the time comes. And there are consultants that come in to do this for you, and once you get big enough that you just have a lot of lawsuits, you just have staff that are set up for it all the time, so you can handle the steady flood of lawsuits that come in if you're something like Google or Pac Bell and you're just getting sued all the time. And then there's response, incident response. When you discover a security breach at your company, then some kind of significant failure of your security service, then, for example, at the White House, some guy with a knife was right in the elevator going up to like President Obama's house, and they're like, "Hey, wait a minute, this is the Blue and White House. How did this guy get in here with a knife? What's going on around here?" And so once this happens, then you have to detect an incident. When you detect something bad has happened, then you respond to it with containment, saying, first we're going to make sure and stop it from getting worse. So find out what systems are affected, to turn them off, isolate them, like the IRS turned off their website all day because something was wrong, and they said, well, let's not let it get any bigger. Let's not have more people sending in more data to a system that's compromised. And then you have mitigation, where you clean out the problem, and then you have reporting of what you found, and then you have a recovery process where you get back to normal operations, and then you have the postmortem where you say, all right, let's talk about what caused this and what we can do to stop it from happening again. And if you don't do all those things, then you are an immature company that will never really be in control. This will just keep happening to you until you grow up and learn how to do all this, so you become constantly improving, where you learn from each mistake. And that's why I think Cloudflare is the gold standard. They really do this right down to the bottom. They get to the bottom and say, here's what happened, here's how we found it, here's what caused it, here's how we made sure that will never happen again. You got to be like that, or nobody can really trust you. And to be fair, you don't get there in a day. You start out as a company that pretends you have no problems, then you have to admit you have a problem, then you have to try to fix the problem, and then after years of many incidents, you gradually develop this process. So you train your people, write procedures and policies for all this jazz, provide people with the tools they need to do this. All right, so here's an incident handling checklist. determine whether the incident has occurred. There's a lot of things that happen that are not security incidents, like a server goes down, you just bring it back up. A customer forgets their password, you just reset it. There are small things that do not represent a significant loss of security. They're just ordinary business. And so you have to have management who is qualified to declare an incident. This is serious. I remember doing this when I was in the financial sector. A customer, we had claimants calling us all the time. We had like 100 phone operators answering calls from people. Somebody called and said, there's something wrong with my check. It's got the wrong name on it. My name is Martha, but this check says Mary. And they say, okay, well, that's not too important. Then another one calls. They say, can you fax me that check? And they faxed them a check. We looked at the check. The check was the wrong name, but the right address and the wrong dollar amount. And we said, there's no question about it. We mailed out the wrong check. Now we stopped and said, holy crap. How did this happen? How many checks did we just send out? Were they all wrong? And the first question is, what's the total exposure here? If they were all wrong, what's the total dollar amount? How big is this problem? Because he said it was 5 p.m. on Friday. And he said, I have friends. I could call the Bank of America and get someone to turn around and drive back in and freeze that account right now. How many thousands of dollars are we at risk here? And I was the guy figuring out, what went wrong. Something was off by one, this name and that. How I figured out how many checks were wrong and how many total dollars they were wrong by. So that's what you do here. Is there an incident and how bad is it? And then what do we do to try to lower the damage right now? Because we could stop all those checks and then all those people, the check will bounce. They'll all have to pay a $10 fee. They will all get mad at us. And is that going to be better than letting them cash all those checks? Because how wrong are they? So that's containment. You try to limit the damage, then you try to eradicate the malware or whatever it is, and then you try to recover your systems back to use. And there's a list of steps you go through to do all that. So you have to detect it somehow with log files or some other intrusion detection system where somehow you detect when a bad thing has happened. If you don't have intrusion detection systems and log monitoring, then you won't detect it until something happens, like a customer complains, or some machine goes down, or somebody notices I can't get my email, which means you let it get pretty far before you caught it. Then you contain it, prevent further damage, isolate the systems, stop processing data on systems that are compromised, collect the data, and of course this is going to impact your business. You're going to have things going down while you try to find out what happened. Then you determine the cause and clean systems. You have to get to the root cause. Otherwise, it's like you find a roach in your house, you step on it and say, there, that's all fixed now. There's another 100 somewhere. You haven't really solved the problem. And then you report it. There's a non-technical report that goes to management, which answers the management level questions. How big was the problem? What in general terms caused the problem? How much will it cost to fix? How long will it take to fix? And how effective will the fix be, in general terms? At first, I was very reluctant to do this kind of thing with management because I felt like it was stupid. They should know all the technical stuff that I knew. But that's the reason you hire technical people, is so they will figure out all the gobbledygook and boil it down to actionable business intelligence, which is, you could do this or that. This would cost this much. This would cost that much. Here's information that will help you guide in that decision. The management has a job, which is driving the boat, and it is not getting lost in all the bits and code. That's your job, to wade through all that detailed stuff and give them something they can understand at the top. Not because they're stupid, but because they have to make a management level decision. I either have to shut down this part of the business, outsource it, buy some product, change our process. They need to make that decision. So you recover, get things back to normal, and hopefully, and of course you have to do some monitoring to make sure you really got it, because frequently you think you understand the problem, you think you've stopped it, and you're wrong. There's more to it, and when you get back in business, you find out there's still a problem and you have to go through another process. It kind of reminds me of brain surgery. If you have epileptics, they have part of the brain that is twisted up and causing seizures, and there are two people involved. There's a surgeon who wants to cut out more of the brain to stop the epileptic seizures, and there's a rehabilitation person who wants to cut out less so there's a better rehabilitation, and you have to compromise, and everything is like this. If you shut down the business for longer, you can more effectively remediate the problem, but you do more damage while the business is shut down, and therefore you miss both ways. You shut it down too long and waste money, you shut it down not long enough and don't really find the problem. Both of the errors will happen. Anyway, then you eventually remediate it, fix the thing that caused the problem, do things like change everybody's password, do some improvement like switch to 2-factor, so hopefully it won't happen again. And then you have, this is where people usually quit because they just want to get back in the business of running their business, but you have to actually stop and post-mortem go over the whole thing. What really happened here? What really caused it? What should we be doing differently? How should we restructure the management? How should we restructure the flow of customers coming through the system and whatever we do? How can we make it so that we have a better business where this kind of stuff is not going to happen again?
Or at least less likely.
Yeah, that's right. As much as you can. Nothing's ever perfect. And even if it was perfect, next week somebody would invent a new attack and you'd be in the soup again. I mean, it's a constant struggle. This is what Bill Gates said when they accused him of being a monopoly. He said, I might have 99% of the desktop, but we're running as fast as we can, and if we ever stumble, we'll be forgotten, which happened shortly after that. Microsoft fell. They're now down to like 80%. And IE is like 20%. In many ways, Microsoft does not rule the world of IT the way they used to 10 years ago because they couldn't keep up, because they could not transition to mobile devices properly. So root cause analysis is where you really figure out exactly what the problem was so you can really fix it. Other than that, you're just like fixing symptoms but not the disease, and incidents will keep coming back. All right, so let's do these cahoots, and that's as far as we'll go today. So, what process gets evidence for a lawsuit? Okay, that's e-discovery. All right, which control is also called compartmentalization. Okay, that's need to know, where you prevent people from knowing things they don't need to know you. It's called horizontal privileges, where they only know a certain scope of information. All right, which control requires personnel to keep secrets? Non-disclosure agreements, and by the way, the previous one, that's where they get the SCI. SCI is the military sensitive compartmented information. You have to have that clearance, which means not only are you cleared vertically to like top secret, but you also have a need to know this topic. Then you can go to the SCI briefing for only the people that need to know about this. Right. So which process includes writing IR policies? That's preparation, of course. That's how you prepare your company to deal with incidents that may come. All right. Which process has to include a non-technical explanation? That's reporting. That's an important part of your report. You also have a technical part. You have a non-technical summary, like Microsoft always has a management executive summary at the top. And then the technical blah blah. You need both of those things. All right. And which process includes submitting a final report to management? That's the postmortem. The final report's when it's all over. There's reporting during the incident, where you give them information to guide them in handling the incident, but the final report is when it's all over. That's the postmortem. All right. So, E times 2, and Ron times 2, and Tony. And that's it. We'll just pick up here next time. And if anybody is ready next time, we'll do the early presentations. They get an extra 5 points. After that, we'll do the regular and late presentations. And if the last ones are any model, I expect good presentations. The last ones were quite good. So that's it. I'm just going to clean up. I'll take a look in the hacking lab and see if anybody needs help. But usually there's not much of that happening from this class because there's no hands-on projects in this class.